What if the nicest person you've ever met was actually the most dangerous? What if their kindness wasn't kindness at all, but a setup? That basically describes the nice guy or girl, narcissist, who doesn't typically control using outbursts. So they don't insult, belittle, or explode, at least not at first. But once they know you're hooked, that's when the real manipulation begins. Welcome to the Common Ego community. My name is Christina, and I'm a toxic relationship recovery coach. If you think you've had a relationship with a narcissist, download the free checklist to see how your experience stacks up with the typical phases of narcissistic abuse. Link in the description. So, who is this nice guy narcissist? Well, it's important to know that not all narcissists present as loud, arrogant, or openly cruel, especially early on. And that's why narcissism isn't as obvious as most people think. And it's also why so many of us suffer their abuse for years before we finally stumble upon a term or a YouTube video that explains everything. So let's talk about this nice guy or nice girl. It's really not about gender. Let's talk about this nice guy narcissist. They're so hard to spot because they seem like the last person who would ever play the villain in your story. At least that's how they seem at first. So they may come off as humble, giving, or even selfless. And unlike their overt counterparts, they don't dominate a room. They're usually softer, quieter, and they definitely seem more emotionally available. But none of this is who they are. It's more like a strategy. You see, a truly kind person helps because they care. A nice guy narcissist helps because it puts them in control. So every thoughtful gesture or apparent sacrifice is actually a down payment on a future expectation of theirs. They're definitely keeping tabs, but they're only keeping tabs on the things they've done for you. It doesn't matter how much you do for them in return or how long it's been since they've done something nice. They will never deduct from your tab. So you will always be in debt to them. And they can even start as the rescuer. So they might step in when you're at your lowest, offer support, or just make you feel safe. But as you might have guessed by now, this isn't about helping you. It's about securing dominance in the relationship because they believe their niceness earns them your devotion, gratitude, and more importantly, compliance. And sadly, this often works. So later in the relationship, when the niceness is gone, you end up either feeling like you owe them something or you're surviving on scraps of kindness, wondering when that nice guy or girl will come back around. And at first, the shift is subtle. So maybe they joke about all they've done for you. Maybe they pull back if you don't react with enough enthusiasm. Or maybe they start needing constant reassurance that you appreciate them. But if you set a boundary, like saying no or pushing back, then nice disappears. This is what makes them so dangerous. So, unlike overt narcissists, their control tactics hide behind selflessness. If you call them out, they will flip it on you. So they might say something like, I was only trying to help. You're so ungrateful. No one has ever been as ungrateful as you are. Appreciation is huge for this type of narcissist. And they'll be generous at first with their time, affection, and maybe even with gifts. But as time goes on, they will do the absolute bare minimum, if even that, and expect praise for it in return. So I've said this one before, but it's something like if they do the dishes without being asked, they expect you to throw a full on parade in their honor. So now let's talk about the hidden agenda behind this all. So, what are they really after? Well, the nice guy narcissist doesn't dominate, boast, or control outright. And instead, they make you feel lucky to have them. They invest in being the perfect partner, patient, understanding, and endlessly giving. They invest pretty heavily at first. And because they seemed so genuine in the beginning, you don't question their motives. So for months, years even, you trust that their kindness is real. So when you start noticing the little things, entitlement, lack of empathy, passive aggressive guilt trips, you doubt yourself instead of them. As they like to remind you, they have done so much for you. So you brush it off. So at first, you might notice that they expect a thank you for everything, even the smallest gestures. Even when you're doing more for them than they're doing for you, and they're not saying thank you. And maybe you notice that in those times when you don't match their level of effort, that they will just sulk. So they're not doing those things out of the kindness of their heart. They're doing it for something in return. But instead of seeing all of this for what it is as transactional, you just tell yourself that they have a big heart and they wear it on their sleeve, right? So things really get to them because they care so much. And then the devaluation starts, but it doesn't quite look like abuse. Not the abuse that you are familiar with, and especially not at first. At first, it looks like them pulling away, maybe getting colder and acting less invested. But because you've already labeled them the nice guy, you don't see it for what it is. You see it as evidence that you must have done something wrong. Must have been you. Maybe you weren't grateful enough. Maybe you hurt them in some way. Maybe you're the problem. And this is where power and victimhood comes into play. The second you start over explaining, over apologizing, or working harder to prove that you do care, they've won. They've flipped the script so completely that you are now the villain in their story. And you're bending over backwards trying to prove them wrong. But eventually they will reveal their true colors. At some point, the mask is going to slip. But if you've been wrapped up in the story of their niceness long enough, you're not going to recognize it right away. You'll feel the shift. But instead of seeing it as manipulation, you'll assume that it's something you did, especially since the first signs are pretty subtle. So maybe they start making little digs at you, disguised as jokes. If you call them out, they act confused. They might say something like, "Come on, I was just teasing. You're too sensitive." And maybe they sulk when you don't respond the way they expect. But when you ask what's wrong, they shrug it off. "Nothing, I'm fine." And you can feel something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. And then things start amping up and they start testing boundaries. And because they're testing your boundaries, sometimes the answer is going to be a no. But if you say no to something, they're going to push back. Not aggressively at first. They might say something like, "Wow, I just wanted to do something nice for you, but okay." Or, "I guess I just care more than you do." They frame their disappointment as proof that you're failing them, planting doubt in your mind the whole time. And once things progress a little further, the entitlement is no longer hidden. You start to notice how they expect praise for basic decency, how they act like their efforts make them superior to you. And if you don't express enough gratitude, they sulk or withdraw affection. And when you finally push back, when you stop over apologizing, stop walking on eggshells, they don't just get upset, they unravel. This is when the nice guy act disappears completely. Suddenly, they're angry, cold, and dismissive. They might give you the silent treatment, lash out, or twist your words to make you feel like the bad guy. And they might do all of the above. And because they spent so much time convincing you that they were different, so much time making you believe that they were the one person who would never hurt you. It's shocking. But here's the truth. This is always who they were. The kindness, the patience, the selflessness. It was all about securing control. The moment they realized you wouldn't keep feeding their ego the way they expected, they stopped pretending. And this is the hardest moment in the relationship because you're stuck between who they were and who they are now. And you don't want to believe they were lying the whole time. But that's the trap. The only reason they seemed so different from the other narcissists was because they needed to be. The real version of them is the one standing in front of you now, distant, resentful, and punishing you for no longer playing along. So if you're watching this and still wondering whether you're dealing with a nice guy narcissist or just having normal relationship struggles, I get it. The nice guy narcissist is not obvious to spot, especially at first. So what I'll say is this. Everyone has bad days. Every relationship has bad days. But narcissists show entitlement, lack of empathy, and need for control over and over again. So it's consistent behavior. They're making you feel bad. They're making you feel like you're the problem. They're knocking you down pretty much every chance they get. And there are patterns of them doing this consistently over time. You'll also notice that their kindness is not steady. it's more strategic. So if you feel guilty setting boundaries, if their generosity feels like a debt you have to repay, if their patience turns into resentment the moment you don't comply, you're not just dealing with normal relationship issues. You're dealing with manipulation. And try not to get too hung up on any diagnosis. Focus on how you feel and whether you're being manipulated. So if you think you're in this situation, here's how to protect yourself. Trust patterns, not words. If their kindness always comes with strings, it's not kindness, it's control. Guilt does not equal obligation. And be sure to set boundaries early. The sooner you set boundaries, the faster you'll see if that all that niceness is real. And all along, watch for entitlement. Do they expect praise for basic decency? Do they sulk when you don't comply? That right there is your warning sign if they do. Don't explain, justify, or defend. The more you try to prove your side, the more control you give them. Really, the only way to win this game is to stop playing. They weren't nice, they were strategic. And now that you see it, you don't have to fall for it again. And if you've met a narcissist like we've been talking about here today, you may have noticed that they seem to be the opposite of what you'd think a narcissist to be. So instead of showing their grandiosity, they hide it beneath a mask of modesty. And I talk about exactly how they do that in the video that just popped up on the screen. So give that a watch. But before you go, be sure to like this video if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.